Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and today I'm going to be talking with Leisa Schaim, and our topic is going to be how to integrate the natal chart when doing electional astrology and specific techniques that you should pay attention to when you are trying to make sure that an electional date will be auspicious, not just for the general electional chart itself, but also for the natal chart of whoever is initiating the venture with you. So thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome.
All right. So let's get into this. So where should we, I'm trying to think of where to start. So we already talked. So we're approaching this episode assuming people have already listened to our long 3-hour episode on electional astrology pretty much, right?
Yeah, I think so. Especially because both of us agreed that we tend to look at the standalone electional chart first and then start fine-tuning at the end with the natal chart.
Yeah, and that's just a matter of, our approach and what makes most sense in terms of like the time breakdown, especially in working with clients. If you're doing electional astrology for people, there's just so many rules in electional astrology, and it's so difficult already to find like a handful of auspicious electional charts that it just makes more sense oftentimes to start with that and figure out what the good charts are, and then to compare them to the natal chart and use that as sort of like a tiebreaker in order to figure out not just the best standalone electional chart, but which one will be good for the native.
Definitely. And that's usually where I bring in the natal chart for sure. I'll usually, after doing all of the standalone rules, really just end up with a handful of kind of like final contenders for charts. And then that's the point at which I start looking at the natal with that. I mean, of course, I glance at it at the beginning, but for the most part, I'm looking at the standalone.
Right. And so we talked about that before, where you still want to take the natal chart into account. But one of the reasons I don't, oftentimes when teaching electional astrology, why I don't spend a lot of time talking about how to integrate the natal chart into it is just because that's almost like that's natal astrology. And that's something that most people already know. Like most people already know how to pay attention to their transits and like what transits are going to be more positive and which ones are going to be more challenging. And it's almost like a separate thing that you assume already everybody already knows. And that's one of the reasons I don't often include it in like general lectures on electional astrology. But for the purpose of this, I thought it would still be good to go over since there might be some people that have questions about what to prioritize in terms of looking at that.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, any other preliminary like philosophical remarks we should make? I mean, we did touch a little bit on the concept of how, somebody could theoretically initiate something like a business that could go on to be successful. But if the electional chart doesn't match well with their natal chart, they could end up, not being a part of that, like getting cut out of the business or something. And the business itself goes on to be successful, but it doesn't really work very well for them somehow subjectively if their relationship with the electional chart to their natal chart is not very good in terms of the synastry.
Yeah, yeah, the synastry and also the natal promise in terms of, and hopefully you're kind of looking at that first as you start out doing the election, but like what is, sort of what is promised or what is not promised. And usually, of course, it's like an in between. But, what is the quality of that area of the chart?
Yeah, so that's actually a good starting point because that comes up sometimes when people are like, there's different areas. So there's the 12 different houses, and each of those matches different topics in our life or different areas that we might focus on. And so one of your base questions going into any election, if you wanted to look at it from the perspective of natal astrology, might be just that, which is, does this person have a suitable natal chart that's going to make this area of their life more easy, or is this going to be an area where there's already major challenges or blockages that exist?
Right, exactly. And while, as we mentioned in the other podcast, we wouldn't necessarily turn away someone looking for an election, even, if that area of their life in their natal chart wasn't ideal looking. We still wouldn't be in the position of saying, like, I don't think you should do this, probably. Like I know that you said you felt that way, right?
Yeah, that I don't think it's your job most of the time in like 99% of the cases to tell the person you shouldn't do this. This is probably going to fail. Your job is to go into it assuming that they have pretty much set their mind to doing this. And your job is to help them mitigate the damage as much as possible or to give them a slight edge so that if there's any chance or any hope that they could pull that thing off, that you're going to pick the best date that you possibly can in terms of their in terms of the electional chart and in terms of their natal chart to accentuate the most positive possibilities. And part of the reason for that is I think it's arrogant on the part of the astrologer on some level because there's always some uncertainty ultimately when you're reading a chart or when you're reading transits or even electional chart or anything else about how exactly this is going to manifest and work itself out.
Hmm.
And sometimes even when you see something negative, you don't always know if it's going to be worst case scenario or if it's going to be something more manageable and more mild.
Definitely.
And as a result of that, the astrologer saying just absolutely in no uncertain terms, this no way this is going to work and you absolutely shouldn't do it comes off as arrogant to me because then it's like saying there's just no possible way and I see exactly how this is going to manifest when as astrologers we know that things are sometimes a bit more malleable than that.
Yeah, for sure. And especially because in most cases, you're not going to see like a worst case scenario configuration in the chart. Usually it's still somewhat nuanced, even if it's like negative or something.
Yeah.
Um, and also, you don't know, like you said, exactly how that's going to play out in terms of maybe there's something negative, say, in the area of life that they want to do something in, but you don't know whether that's going to be like constantly negative or episodically. For instance, like someone could have something bad with regard to marriage, but it could be like they have a successful marriage for like 10, 15 years and then their spouse dies suddenly or something like that.
Right.
And you wouldn't want to say don't get married because of that.
Yeah, because they A, that's their choice, but B, they might make that same choice anyways to have
Hmm.
a 10-year marriage of like the love of their life, even if you knew you were going to suffer some major hardship at some point during the course of that. You still do it. And that's not necessarily something you're supposed to avoid per se.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, and most people also, you raised an interesting point, which is that most people at least have some mitigations. There's usually like some mitigating factors somewhere, and that's why you rarely see like the worst case scenario,
Hmm.
even if there's difficulties or blockages in some part of the chart.
Definitely. And I guess one of the ways that I find it helpful to look at the area of life in the natal chart with respect to what they're trying to do with an election is to kind of give you a sense of sometimes you'll kind of see it match up with the electional possibilities that you're finding, and it depends a lot, of course, on the range, the kind of scope of time that's available to you that they give you. But I've noticed, for instance, and I don't usually go looking for it in the beginning, but I have noticed after the fact sometimes when I'm looking through a range of times, whatever their restrictions have been sometimes like, and this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens sometimes where I'm just like, these are like not very good options, compared to the average. And I will notice then sometimes that matches up with whatever is going on in their natal chart.
Yeah, or the opposite, where the person just has like the best stuff in a certain part of their chart and they're asking you to do an election, and you happen to have like an amazing election for that very topic
Yeah.
that's coming up in the near future in their time frame.
Definitely. Like they'll give you just like 2 or 3 options and like no, time variance, and they'll be like great options.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that probably does go back to the idea of the natal promise that that the birth chart itself, that there's a number of different areas where there's different promises that are made at the moment of birth of things that will happen in the life. And then at some point, the natal potential of those placements or those alignments will manifest in the person's life for better or worse.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about some then. So this is basic natal astrology in terms of especially traditional astrology and things that I deal with in the Hellenistic course. But in terms of looking at different topics or areas of life to figure out what the natal promise is, we would be talking about things like, especially looking at the houses as the specific areas of life that pertain to different topics. So if somebody's asking you to do a marriage election, you would want to look at their seventh house to see what their natal marriage prospects are. If they're talking about career, you would want to look at their 10th house. If they're talking about like a foreign journey, you would look at the ninth house. If they're talking about something with a friend or a group or alliances, you would look at the 11th house. What else?
Like home and family, 4th house, income, 2nd house, things like that.
Income. Third house, siblings, short
Mhm.
distance travel, maybe communication.
Mhm.
Fifth house, children. Sixth house, work and illness.
Mhm.
First house, both mind and body, health and appearance.
Mhm.
Sometimes important for medical elections or even like
Cosmetic surgery.
cosmetic elections.
Mhm.
Um, let's see. Eighth house can sometimes be for death, inheritance,
Taxes.
taxes, other people's money,
Mhm.
things like that.
Mhm.
And 12th house. Is there anything we would use the 12th house for that's more productive? Like going off to
Spiritual
an
retreat.
ashram?
No, I've actually seen that.
Okay. Have you done
Yeah.
an electional chart for going off to an
I
ashram?
can't remember, but it was involved in some consult in some capacity I had, and I said, yeah, actually 12. No, I think it actually was an election.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like an election for going to jail or something?
I haven't had that one.
No, okay. One of these days.
Yeah. But yeah, I would say probably going to an ashram or maybe just personal retreat.
Right. So
Yeah.
those are the areas that we'd focus on for looking at different topics. And then in terms of what you would look at to see if it's sort of well situated in their life or not well situated, you would primarily focus on the benefics and malefics, the
Mhm.
benefics being Venus and Jupiter, and the malefics being Mars and Saturn. And just figuring out what house, if you have benefics in that house, it's going to tend to be an area of greater ease in the person's life where more fortunate circumstances are going to tend to take place. Versus if they have the malefics in a house, then there's going to tend to be more challenges and difficulties, and sometimes even hardships or traumas in that area of the life.
Mhm. Right. So primarily looking at the placements within those topical houses, as well as which planets rule those houses.
Right. We'll get to that in a second, but just building it up from the basics. So looking at houses, looking at the benefics and malefics in houses. One point before we get to the ruler is using sect, like we did in the electional episode, and applying that to the natal chart, because it's not just a matter of the benefics and malefics, but it's especially looking at using sect to identify the most positive planet in the chart, as well as the most negative planet in the chart. So the basic trick with that is determine if the person has a day chart or a night chart. And they have a day chart if the sun is above the horizon, above the degrees of the ascendant-descendant axis. And they have a night chart if the sun is below the degrees of the ascendant-descendant axis. And if they have a night chart, if they have a day chart, so day chart, sun above the horizon, most positive planet is Jupiter, most negative planet is Mars. So you're going to want to pay a special attention to those two planets as indicating the extremes in the person's life. And if you have the most positive planet in a house, then that's going to tend to be one of their best houses. And if they have the most negative planet in a house, that's going to tend to be one of their most challenging or difficult houses.
Definitely.
So Jupiter and Mars for day charts. For night charts, you focus on Venus as the most positive planet and Saturn as the most negative or challenging planet. So that's useful because that lets you identify the extremes, but also the other two benefics and malefics end up being more moderate in that scenario.
Right. So the benefics and malefics will still act as benefics and malefics, but whereas the benefic of the sect will be the most positive area of the life, whatever house it's placed in, the benefic that's not of the sect will be just more like moderately positive or might have challenges along with the positive. Yeah.
Right. And then the malefic, so you mentioned the benefic or the malefic?
Yeah, benefic. So then,
Okay.
yeah.
So and then the malefic is also more moderate, where it tends to indicate the keyword I use for the moderate benefic is surmountable difficulties.
Right.
So that's going to be Saturn in a day chart or Mars in a night chart. And it's going to tend to indicate some challenges, but they tend to be those things that are like the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or it presents a barrier or an obstacle, but it's something the person gets over and sometimes actually becomes stronger from as a result. So that's really useful information because then that means that those malefics may indicate challenges, but they're going to be negotiable ones and it may not be a deal breaker. So the benefics, it's sort of the same. They're still positive, but they're not quite as positive as they could be. And that's Venus in a day chart and Jupiter in a night chart. So they're kind of like nice things sometimes that are okay to emphasize, but they're not the main thing that you want to focus on that's going to be the most positive in the person's life.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So, and I think in the electional course, I've already talked about this a bit in the terms of elections, but I just wanted to reemphasize it here because it's so crucial in the context of natal astrology for identifying the most challenging areas of the life and the most positive areas of the life. And then those are going to tend to be things that you want to gravitate towards emphasizing both in the natal placement as well as in the transits in the electional chart later on.
Right. And we'll get to that in a bit here. But yeah, that's why primarily that this is really important, because one of them can be much more important than the other for either emphasizing the positive of or de-emphasizing the negative of. And whereas say maybe the malefic that is of the sect, if it has transits close to the natal chart, might not be a deal breaker. It might actually be a deal breaker if it's the malefic contrary to the sect that's having close transits.
Right, exactly. So, okay, so we've set that up with benefics and malefics and looking at the houses.
Hmm.
And the other thing that you already mentioned, the next step would be looking at the ruler of the house
Right.
as indicating the ultimate outcome of the affairs of that house. So planets in the house tend to be a little bit more immediate in what they indicate about the house, but the ruler ultimately tends to indicate the outcome or the final result of that house after everything is said and done.
Right.
So that's another one where you want to look at the ruler of the house that you're investigating and look at what its condition is. Is it well placed by sign? Like, is it in its own domicile or exaltation? Is it in a good house, which is one of the houses that are configured to the ascendant? Is it configured to benefics? And all the other basic things of planetary condition that you learn in terms of basic natal astrology that determine whether a planet is well placed or poorly placed. So those are positive things. Conversely, the ruler of a house is poorly placed if it's in, not a good sign for it, like it's a sign of its depression or
Or fall.
fall.
Hmm.
Well, no, depression is fall,
Oh,
but the
yes.
other one, which is detriment,
Detriment, yeah.
detriment. So detriment, if it's in a bad sign, if it's in a bad house, so one of the houses that isn't configured to the ascendant, especially the 6th, 8th, or 12th house, is the planet afflicted by malefics? Does it have hard aspects, especially from one or both of the malefics, especially the malefic that's contrary to the sect? So the most difficult malefic in the chart, if the ruler of a house is getting a hard, especially a close hard aspect from that planet, that's going to be really problematic for what that house wants to signify.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, and so these are all, of course, just what you would normally look at in terms of the natal chart delineations in general. And you're just this is kind of preliminary stuff to keep in mind as you're trying to do an election for the person. You're not necessarily going to like put all of this in your electional report, but it's kind of good background information for you to know.
Yeah, because if you see that both of the if person's coming to you for a marriage election, you see both the benefics are in the 7th house, you see the ruler of the 7th house is in good shape, then you already know that this person has a lot going for them in terms of their propensity for having successful relationships or becoming successfully married.
Hmm.
Whereas if a person has, let's say, like all of the malefics in the 7th house and the ruler of the 7th house is afflicted in the worst way possible, then that's going to indicate that they have more of a propensity for running into problems with relationships. And that's going to be something you want to be aware of going into your electional chart, because it means the natal promise of the chart is that relationships are going to be more challenging. So they're going to need even more help, or it's going to be even more tricky to make sure there's a really good election for them, to see if you can offset that as much as possible.
Hmm. For sure.
All right. So um, that's some of the basic stuff with natal. I'm trying to think of any other basic natal stuff that one really needs to pay attention to that's just a no-brainer in terms of initial analysis.
Well, kind of similar to what we were talking about with the placements in the topical houses as well as the rulers of those houses. If there's a very clear general significator planet, then I will pay attention to that as well, like, say,
Yeah.
Venus for relationships or weddings or things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's not just we're focusing on like the particular significator, which is sometimes I think called the accidental significator. I always get the terminology mixed up because it's really archaic terminology, but there's also the general significator of the topic. So Venus for relationships, Mercury for communication, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
So yeah, and that will give you additional information about how that general topic in the native's life goes to some extent as well.
Right.
Okay, so that's a good one. All right, so that's all. That's the basic natal stuff, and that's the core stuff of pretty much all you need to know in terms of assessing the initial natal potential and promise for the birth chart, and especially focusing in on, because you're not giving this person like an entire natal reading, for the purpose of doing an electional consultation. You're really just focusing in on the specific house primarily that matches up with the electional chart that you're doing for them. And that's the primary thing you want to focus on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's also helpful if the person, it's hard to assess this with an election sometimes because you're not having like a full out conversation like you would with a consultation.
Mhm.
But it is definitely helpful if the person is like self-aware enough to know that how that area of life has gone so far for them
Right.
in terms of just like, again, it can be subtle or challenging sometimes, but just like the whole managing the expectations piece and that elections can't completely overrule everything.
Yeah, so that's an important piece that you brought up in the electional episode in terms of managing expectations and making them understand that the election is a combination of trying to pick an auspicious or a lucky date, but also what the person's already bringing to the table in terms of their birth chart.
Mhm. Yeah, so it can be, I mean, that's a helpful thing to just keep in mind if you're doing elections in general, but also might be specifically good to somehow include at least like briefly in the write-up or in the conversation or whatever you however you communicate that to the person or the client. If you particularly see that they have a challenging chart for that particular topic that they're trying to get an election for.
Well, it's hard because that's the part that's not negotiable. Just like
Yeah,
the dates themselves at the time frame that they have to do the election is often not negotiable, that they have certain fixed time frames when they can initiate the venture for many things.
definitely.
Like having a wedding, you can't usually pull off a wedding at like 2 o'clock in the morning.
Right. Well, sometimes in Vegas, but
Yeah, I mean, some people are willing to like really go out of their way.
yeah,
I mean, we've done some pretty crazy timing stuff
yeah,
at weird hours, but for most clients, in order to get together like 100 people for a wedding or something like that, there's certain times you can do it and there's certain times you can't, and that's not negotiable.
right.
You just have to work within the bounds and the constraints of what you have. It's kind of the same thing for the natal chart where there's just certain things that are built into it and those are there and that's not negotiable. So it's a little tricky in terms of talking to them because you don't want to. Sometimes that's just like astrologer information and that's not
Yeah.
necessarily like client information.
No, for sure. I was just saying more of a general disclaimer that you might want to particularly make sure you have something like that thrown in there, just like a sentence or something, if you can see that the client has a difficult area that they still want to do an election for.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't know, somebody wrote me after our electional episode, I think a few days ago, asking like if he could pick a good time to buy lottery tickets. And I think that's where something like that partially comes into play, which
Hmm.
is, you can try, I guess, to pick a good electional date. But if your natal chart in and of itself isn't already highly predisposed to something extremely unique like that, where you'd have to have very fortunate placements, like in the financial sector and other stuff like that, then you can't just like do an election and it's going to make everything perfect.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah. So that's part of managing expectations with clients. All right, so we figured out the basic natal promise of the birth chart, and the next step then is realizing that the electional chart is basically acting like transits, that the electional chart is a transit chart to the person's natal chart, but it's one that's going to be permanent or it's going to stay with them permanently.
Right.
So that's the primary way that you need to look at the electional chart when you're starting to integrate the natal chart, is understanding that at the date that comes up in the future on the electional date that you've picked, that person's going to have certain transits that day and they're going to be responding and experiencing those transits on that date in a certain way. But whatever those transits are and whatever the sort of like energy or vibe is that they experience that day is probably going to be with them permanently as long as that election is around or whatever they initiated with that election on that date.
Right, definitely. So you could kind of think of this a little bit similar to like having someone in your household, like a partner or a family member or someone, and you constantly have that synastry activated, right? It's kind of like that, where whatever project or venture you've started at that point, it's like a constant set of transits that's always interacting with your own.
Yeah, it's like getting a new roommate.
Right, kind of,
You
yeah.
just had a new roommate move in. And the question is this like a loud person that's like annoying you constantly and that you're constantly like butting heads with? Or is this somebody who just like becomes your best friend and for whatever reason you both get along and really click and never bug each other, but instead somehow end up enhancing each other's lives in some way?
Yeah, for sure. And so while on the one hand, the electional chart definitely acts as a standalone chart, and you can definitely analyze it after the fact or while you're choosing them in terms of particularly like the ascendant ruler in the first house, and it, becomes its own entity. it is also simultaneously a set of permanent transits.
Right.
So it's kind of got like two different things going on at once.
Yeah. It is an entity unto itself, but it's also a transit to you. And in many instances, not just to you, but into all of the parties involved. Because in
Hmm.
some instances, like when we're talking about a marriage election, that's where things get really tricky because we're
Hmm.
not just talking about one natal chart, we're talking about two natal charts.
Right.
And that, third independent chart, which is the marriage chart, is going to interact with each natal chart in very different ways.
Right, which is actually kind of a pain. And I mean, of course, lots of people get elections for weddings, so it is like a pretty common one, but it is one of the kind of unique ones where you always have to look at more than one natal chart.
Yeah, and that's one of the other reasons why I still think that starting with the electional chart and figuring out what the good electional charts are first is the best route to take, because then when you end up with like five electional charts or even like two or three electional charts, and you can then compare those cleanly to see how they're fitting both of the natal charts of, let's say, the two individuals involved, that's a lot cleaner and more manageable and approachable versus the other way, which is like running transits and progressions or time lords or whatever else for both natal charts and trying to like line up the best dates for both of these independently based on their natal charts, which is
Yeah.
a lot more complicated and not as like efficient or effective to do.
Yeah, it can be a little haphazard. I've seen people try to do that, and it does get pretty jumbled. Not to say that it couldn't be done effectively that that way, but yeah, I would agree. I start with standalone and then narrow it down. It is like a good reason, as we're talking about this now. It's a good reason to have like multiple contenders at the very end, before you choose your final chart, because once you do compare these to the natal charts, sometimes you get sort of like a rude surprise.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this doesn't fit well at all.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good piece of advice to come up with the multiple, but to not get too attached to any one chart yet until you do the final comparison with the natal charts, because you need to be prepared to relinquish what may be your favorite standalone electional chart if it turns out that it's just like horrible for one or more of the natal charts involved.
Yeah, and I've definitely had that happen, and it's very frustrating. So it's good to have multiple choices still left.
Yeah, and one thing, it's really good to think about it in terms of your own transits. Like if you were starting something on this day and these were your transits, would you go ahead and start that thing on that day? And I think personalizing it like that is kind of useful because we all pay attention to, as astrologers or as modern Western astrologers, on some level, we all pay attention to our transits on a regular basis. We have a general idea of what transits have been good in the past or bad in the past, and which ones we would probably like gravitate towards versus which ones we would avoid or be more careful about on certain dates. And when you start contextualizing things like that, just in terms of what transits you like more in your personal chart versus which ones you don't, then I think it makes this part of the process a little bit more approachable.
Definitely. Yeah, and especially if you kind of hopefully a lot of you have already been doing this, but if you kind of observe kind of the transiting weather on an ongoing basis, even like small things like quick moving moon applications to other planets, either in your natal chart or to other transiting planets and things like that, and you notice the difference in either how you feel or how people around you are behaving or things like that, like you said, it just starts to get more of a visceral sense of like how this would be to have this as a permanent transit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or like, because there's so many different events that you go through life as an astrologer, and you experience like a certain transit and a certain like negative event or a certain positive event, that becomes part of your sort of collected wisdom as an astrologer in terms of what different planets mean and how you've experienced them in the past.
Hmm.
Um, but it's good to integrate that kind of personal perspective into things just to help you ground what you're doing when you're working with another person's natal chart that you might be unfamiliar with, and where you might be sometimes it's like easier to be detached from it, and sometimes it's necessary to put yourself more in their shoes to figure out like what you would do versus what you wouldn't do in terms of transits and dates and everything else.
No, I've definitely felt that before, especially when I'm kind of frustrated if the final standalone charts aren't lining up all that easily with the natal, and I'm tempted to be like, "Well, that's good enough," but, I have actually stopped for a moment in some past instances and thought, like, "How would that feel, though, for me? Like, would that feel no, that's not good enough."
Right. Yeah. So, all right. So, talking about this, so we're looking at the chart. Um, Partially, it's like a synastry chart. The electional chart is a synastry chart to the natal chart. So, you want to look at it almost like from a synastry perspective about how these two people almost or entities get along.
Mhm,
Because, like, the electional chart becomes like an entity that the person is then in a relationship with from that point forward.
mhm,
And as we've said, it's also like a transit chart. So if you're looking at a transit chart, there's two pieces that we need to think about and be aware of as setting the basic structure for that. One of them, the first one and the primary one, is looking at the transits from the perspective of both whole sign house ingresses into different houses in the chart and into certain whole sign aspects with other planets in the chart. And then the other thing we need to pay attention to is close degree based aspects, especially ones that are within 3 degrees or especially ones that are within 1 degree of exactitude.
mhm. Yeah, so I agree. So when you start looking at the whole sign ingresses to different natal houses and the aspects to them, for instance, it can. I mean, sometimes you don't have a lot of choice, but sometimes you do, depending on the time frame. So, for instance, if I was doing like a wedding election, I am sometimes cautious about like having the malefics as a permanent transit to like the fourth house or the seventh house, for instance, because home life and then partnership obviously are very vital for that particular electional reason.
Yeah, and that's a good one. So a transit begins as soon as a planet moves into the whole sign house, but especially with the angular houses, it becomes more prominent or becomes more acute when it gets closer to the exact degree of the angle. So, in the instance of like marriage in the seventh house, if Mars was to ingress into the seventh whole sign house, which is the seventh sign from the rising sign, then that means that they have that Mars transiting their seventh house of relationships as soon as it moves into that sign. Although it's going to reach the peak or the height of its intensity as soon as it hits the exact degree of the descendant or the degree opposite to the ascendant.
Hmm.
And those are two, if you had to choose between those two, so that provides us with two different options and two different levels of intensity of what would be not great versus what would be the worst case scenario. So, not great would be Mars somewhere in the seventh whole sign house, but not very close to the degree of the descendant.
Right.
Whereas, worst case scenario is like Mars is exactly to the degree on the degree of the descendant. That's going to be a much more acute, much more problematic, um, permanent transit to have Mars sitting right on your descendant. And then you want to integrate sect into that, of course, because that's going to be worse if the person was born natally with a day chart, because Mars is the worst planet in day charts, versus it would be more challenging in night charts if that was Saturn.
Right. And so sometimes by house, you can avoid putting it in those, in the angles or in those topical houses that are like particularly important for the topic of the election. So do that if you can. If you can't, at least keep it away from those angles by degree. When we're talking about planets, probably in a moment too. But yeah, definitely for the houses, you it would be much worse, as you said, if one of the malefics, and especially the malefic contrary to sect, was like very closely aligned with one of the angles.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute. So you want to take that concept of sect and the most positive and negative planet, and you want to start applying it to the transits. So there's a little bit of a tricky thing here where oftentimes or sometimes you're going to have a difference between the sect of the natal chart and the sect of the electional chart.
Hmm.
Where in the natal chart, they may have like a day chart. So Mars is the most difficult planet and Jupiter is the most positive, versus in your electional chart, it could be reversed, where if the election's a night chart, then Venus is the most positive planet and Saturn's the most negative. So, in terms of the standalone electional chart, you pay attention to the sect of the chart itself when you're picking planets to make prominent or not make prominent. But in terms of relating it back to the natal chart, in terms of how the person is going to experience it, you want to focus on the sect of their chart and what is the most positive and negative planet for them relative to their own birth chart. So, if they were born during the day, you want to be careful about Mars and you want to try to emphasize Jupiter. Whereas if they were born at night, you want to be careful about Saturn, and you want to try to emphasize Venus.
Hmm. Definitely. And I think if you've been working with sect at all in your own life or with clients, you can see a pretty striking difference oftentimes in how people experience these transits. And so I know watching that when I first learned sect, it made me realize exactly how important it was to track those things and to differentiate which were the best and most challenging ones. So it can be hard sometimes, say, with if it's a night chart, Saturn's a really slow transit. So it's like a 2.5 to 3 year transit. But that's by sign. And so, you might not be able to like completely move it out of a sign or something. But you can still be careful about exactly how closely it's aspecting things in the chart by degree.
Yeah, definitely that there's going to be certain dates over that 3-year period where Saturn's going to be like exactly aspecting the degree of something versus there's others where it's not going to be close at all.
Hmm.
So at least their experience of that transit will be less intense than it could have been otherwise as a permanent transit.
Yeah, exactly.
But going back to the whole sign thing, that also was a good point that, we're talking about the seventh house and a planet transiting through the seventh house versus being on the degree of the descendant. But then from that perspective, also, if your time frame has an electional chart where Saturn's not in the seventh sign, but instead it's in like the sixth whole sign house or it's in the eighth whole sign house, then yeah, that might be more optimal too. If you can just barely move the difficult transit outside of the primary house that we're talking about, the whole sign house, that's probably going to be the ideal situation.
For sure.
So, and that's especially the case if the transit we're talking about is the most difficult planet, you're going to want to go out of your way to do that. Now, if
Hmm.
it's a malefic, but it's not the most difficult one, if it's like Mars in a night chart or Saturn in a day chart, that might be a little bit more negotiable. That's not ideal, but you might be able to get away with having that malefic in the house under consideration because it's going to be problematic, but it might be a little bit more surmountable than it could be otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that that kind of question comes up pretty frequently in doing elections. And so you can I still try to keep them away from the exact angles, if at all possible. But yeah, it makes a big difference choosing between the malefic contrary to sect versus the one of the sect.
Right. Yeah, and that's really crucial to integrate because then it's not just about, avoiding the worst planet all the time, but it's also realizing that you can work with sometimes very constructively the malefic that's of the sect in favor.
Hmm. Right. And that's definitely not worst case scenario. And so it's not something you need to like completely stress over either as the
Right.
electional astrologer.
Yeah, and some people will, and that's, a mistake, or it's something sometimes like a client will really be stressing about where maybe they'll come to you and they'll say, I can't get married because Saturn's going through my seventh house. But if they have a day chart, and their seventh house is otherwise well situated, they might be okay. That just might be like the coming of age type Saturn transit or the permanent long term relationship or the other cliche like Saturn relationship thing, like an age disparity or something like that.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, for sure. But you don't need to tell anyone they need to wait 3 years to get married.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that can sometimes be nice if you're able to answer in that way and say, well, Saturn, because you have a day chart or what have you, is actually more constructive for you. So you actually probably have less reason to be concerned about this transit than you might otherwise.
Exactly.
Or the same with Mars and what have you.
Hmm.
All right. So transits, let's see, what else do we need to talk about in terms of transits? So let's break this down a little bit more. So we're really focused on it's not all transits. So we're using sect here partially. We've already used the house distinction thing between whole sign houses versus the exact degrees of the angles or degree based forms of house division to make a differentiation between those two areas and what is like when the transit becomes operative in a certain part of the chart versus when it becomes at its most severe in some sense.
Hmm.
We're also making that distinction when it comes to the benefics and malefics, and that becomes a really crucial sorting factor for figuring out which transits to really focus on versus which transits to really avoid. Is the most positive planet in the chart and the most negative planet in the chart based on sect. And those are really going to be, it's not the only thing you focus on, but it's definitely at the very top of the transits that you're focused on in terms of You get your final set of electional charts. Let's say you've got just 2 electional charts. Let's make it simple. And then you've got your natal chart that you're going to compare both of those electional charts to. The very first thing your eyes should go to are the most positive and most negative planets in both of those electional charts, from the perspective of the person's sect and how that relates to the natal chart.
Right. And so where those planets are transiting, respectively, during those 2 times to the natal chart.
Yeah. So let's keep talking about our 7th house example, since that one's really easy. At some point, we should switch and talk about like a 10th house example or something like that. But let's say we've got our 2 electional charts, our 2 hypothetical electional charts, and our, let's say, 1 natal chart. For some reason, we're only focusing on one, even though it's marriage. Let's say, like, our friend is the astrologer who's getting married, and we only really care about his natal chart. So what we're going to do is, let's say this person has a day chart natally, and we're going to look at his chart. We're going to look at both of the electional charts, and we're going to immediately zoom in or focus in on Mars and Jupiter. Since he has a natal chart, those are the most positive and most negative planets that he's going to have, especially by transit. So we're going to look and see on our 2 electional dates, is Jupiter prominent and closely aspecting important places in the chart, especially, let's say, the 7th house or planets connected with the 7th house, like the ruler of the 7th? Or do we have Mars prominently transiting some crucial area of the chart, especially ones related to the matter at hand, like the 7th house, the ruler of the 7th house?
Mm-hmm. Right. And those are really the most important. So it's good to just like keep clear about that because there's always lots of transits going on at any given time. So even if you're looking at a few electional chart contenders, that can feel like overwhelming if you're looking at all of the transits.
Yeah, and people can drive themselves crazy if they take in too many factors without really limiting and focusing on what's most important.
Right.
And people start throwing in like asteroids and like Arabic parts and all this other stuff.
Right.
And sometimes can overlook what's actually the most important thing, which I would say, which would be this, which is the most positive and negative planet based on sect.
Right. And I do look at other transits too, but yeah, definitely good to prioritize. And so what you're trying to do is simply keep the most challenging planet away from prominent parts of the chart. So, and away from things, like you said, that most pertain to the topic at hand. So the descendant, say, or the 7th house ruler, or Venus as a general significator. Want to keep Mars in this example away from those. Hopefully away from those by sign, but at least by degree.
Yeah, definitely by degree, and ideally also by sign.
Yeah.
And then other things in terms of when you say prominent parts of the chart, let's specify that as well, because so one of the things that makes, as we talked about in the electional episode, that makes parts of the chart, whether it's a natal chart or an electional chart, prominent is angularity. So the angular houses are the most prominent parts of our chart. And that's true both in terms of the sign, so the 1st whole sign house, the 4th whole sign house, the 7th and the 10th, and then especially also by degree, which is the degree of the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, and IC.
Right. So those are all really prominent, and you want to keep in mind all of these things we've been saying about de-emphasizing the malefic contrary to sect and proactively emphasizing the benefic of the sect with respect to all of those places. I would also add the lights and the ascendant ruler degree.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, and I'll get to that because there's like a few other things in terms of what we mean by prominent in the natal chart that you want to be careful about. But one of the things, let's just break down and give an example. For example, when we're talking about the angles and we're talking about things to focus on or gravitate towards versus to avoid, like an example of that would be if you have one electional chart where the person was born with the day chart, so the most difficult planet for them is Mars, but Mars is exactly on the degree of the ascendant in one of your electional charts, that would be something you'd absolutely want to avoid.
Yeah, that would be a deal breaker.
Or if it was exactly on the degree of the midheaven. I mean, really, if Mars and the person has a day chart is exactly on one of the 4 angles at all, that's pretty much a deal breaker.
Yeah, definitely. Like even if we're talking about a wedding or something, even if it's not the descendant angle, it's still super prominent if it's on any of the angles by degree. So yeah, that would be a deal breaker.
So that's true for people with day charts. For night chart people, it would be Saturn. So if
Hmm.
Saturn is exactly on the degree of the ascendant or the midheaven or the descendant that I see, that's a deal breaker.
Right. Yeah, assuming you have choices.
If you have choices. So
Yeah.
Saturn moves very slowly, so sometimes it can be hard if the person is like, you have a week to pick this election in this time frame and you can't, that's not negotiable, versus if they have 3 or 4 month period or like a year or two period, you might be able to get Saturn further off of the degree of that angle
Hmm.
if you go one way or another with the dates.
Right.
So conversely, interesting, challenging question then is if you have the malefic that's of the sect in favor. So the more moderate malefic, which is Saturn by day or Mars by night, if they are hovering around or somewhere in the vicinity of the degrees of one of the angles, that's not great. And you probably do want to put it as far away from the degree of the angle if you can, but it may not be an absolute deal breaker if that's something, that is there that you can't really negotiate that much. That's not as much of a deal breaker as the malefic that's contrary to the sect.
Definitely. Yeah. And they'll notice the difference. So I mean, you can rely on that. Yeah.
Right. So that's malefics. In terms of benefics, you want to focus on Jupiter if the person is born with a day chart. If you can get Jupiter on the degree of one of those angles, especially exactly, the closer you can get it, the better. So ascendant MC, descendant IC. Or if they have a night chart, then Venus. If you can get Venus on the exact degree of one of the angles. Failing that, if you can't, putting it in one of the angular whole sign houses is the next best thing.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, this is assuming, of course, from your choice of, in this example, we had two charts. So there may or may not be, Venus, say, in one of the angles. But
Yeah.
if you do, then that's clearly the better choice.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of like right now, this month, for example, today it's February 3rd. I should have done the like time and
Oh,
everything.
right.
Actually, we
Yeah.
picked a little, it wasn't an election, but it was at least close enough of, we started recording February 3rd, 2019. It was actually several minutes after this, but it was not too far after 8:07 p.m. in Denver, Colorado with Virgo rising. All right. So, today, for example, February 3rd, 2019, Venus just changed signs.
Hmm.
And I know I was watching on Twitter, it's like there's some friends of ours that have Sagittarius rising, and Venus was just leaving their first house. And there's others that are Capricorn rising where Venus was just moving into their first house.
Hmm.
So sometimes, like if somebody did an election, if you had a choice between an election last week versus this week, for some people, that's going to be the difference between putting Venus in their first whole sign house versus their 12th whole sign house or their second whole sign house, let's say.
Right. Yeah. And normally, in most cases, the first house would be the better house to put it in. I mean, I guess the exception in that instance would be if you were doing something that had particular focus on income, like a new business or something,
Right.
then it would make potentially more sense to put it in the second house. But normally, you want to emphasize it by making it angular.
Yeah, definitely. Or later this year, Jupiter, it will move from, I forget what month it is. It's like around November or October.
December, I think.
Oh, yeah, right. December. So it's going to move from Sagittarius, where it is all year, and it's going to move to Capricorn, I think, in December.
Mm.
So that's going to be a shift from one whole sign house to the next for a lot of people. And if you have an ingress like that, even of an outer planet, then that may give you, a pretty stark difference between placing it in one house versus another if your electional time frame straddles over when that ingress takes place.
For sure. Yeah.
So that's ingresses, and angularity and focusing on those.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's like a very common thing that we're just doing. We just take for granted with respect to that we should mention here before we move on to the next points that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
I mean, because that's one of the things we really focus on first.
Mm.
It's not the only thing we focus on, but in terms of primary what you're doing and what you pay attention to, like the first steps that you're taking when you got your electional charts and you start finally comparing them to the natal chart, angularity is definitely up there in terms of the main, maybe first thing that we're paying attention to, angularity of the most positive and negative planet by transit.
Yeah, angularity and sect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's first line of things. In terms of other prominent or important things, like what makes something prominent in the natal chart, because that's really what we're focused on. We're not going to look at everything, but we're especially going to focus on the most prominent parts of the natal chart.
Hmm.
So angularity dictates prominence. The other thing that dictates prominence is, as you said, the luminaries,
Hmm.
the ruler of the ascendant.
Hmm.
I would add to that also stelliums. Like
Mm.
sometimes if a person has a stellium of like a bunch of planets or like all of their planets, there's like those people born in 1962 that have everything in Aquarius,
Hmm.
then you want to be more careful if you can about those,
Yeah, that's a good point.
just because that becomes sensitive, because then only are the majority or a large cluster of their planets, let's say 3 or 4 or more planets in the same sign and in the same whole sign house, but then all of the houses that those planets rule are also getting dragged into that house.
Right.
So it becomes a very important and very delicate or sensitive area of the chart.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of why, a stellium already looks kind of impressive in terms of having that many planets in one house, but it's really the rulerships that make it actually super complicated or super emphasized, because then it can involve like 2/3 of the chart or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as somebody with a Scorpio stellium, like I know when that stellium is getting activated by transits, or when you have heavy transits like a Mars transit or Saturn transit going through there, it starts just like hitting everything in a row.
Yeah.
So, that's important to pay attention to also in terms of, what does your eye go to first when you first start comparing the electional charts that you have with the natal chart in order to try to determine which one to go with?
Yeah. So I would say the luminaries, the ascendant ruler, factoring in stelliums, and also any general significator. Like I always pay attention to transits to Venus for weddings, for instance.
Okay. And in terms of the luminaries, also, you might want to distinguish there between also the sect light versus the luminary that's contrary to the sect.
Right.
So you're going to want to emphasize, especially, and pay more attention to the sun in day charts or to the moon in night charts. So that if you had a choice, between the two, you're going to emphasize more the sect light because it's the one that's actually providing light in the chart, and it's therefore going to be a more dominant factor in the person's overall nativity.
Definitely. Yeah. So, and what we're talking about in terms of prioritizing that, of course, is that same emphasizing the benefic of the sect and de emphasizing transits from the malefic contrary to the sect, particular to the sect light, whatever the sect light is, sun by day and moon by night.
Right. Yeah. So that if you had a choice then, or if you come down to it and you have like one chart where the sect light is afflicted, let's say by a bad transit to from a malefic,
Hmm.
versus you have another chart where the luminary that's contra the sect is afflicted. Obviously neither of those are great options, but if you have to choose, you go with the one where that's not the luminary that's contrary, that is of the sect that's afflicted.
For sure. So we're talking about like avoiding, in particular, Mars transits to the sun in a day chart and Saturn transits to the moon in a night chart.
Yeah, just because that's going to have a much more global, like overall negative effect on the person's chart and person's life in general. So all of these are just, again, understanding the prioritization of like what's more important and what's less important, so that sometimes when you have to make difficult choices or difficult decisions between two bad options or two not great options, you can know which one to go with. And that's a large part of the process of learning electional astrology, is how to choose between two terrible, terrible choices.
Yeah, it really is, because otherwise you can just get completely paralyzed and indecision over like, well, this has like 5 positive and 5 negative factors, and same on the other one, but they're different factors, and which one wins out, and you
Right.
have to know like what's most important.
Yeah. And have some sort of criteria or factor for figuring out what that is and deciding between them.
Right. And it can still be challenging even if you do know these rules, because it still ultimately can be like a bunch of pluses and minuses, but at least you know which ones are deal breakers versus just like kind of positive or kind of negative.
Right. Yeah. So, sect light, focusing on the sect light and the close aspects to that, you're going to want to especially focus on, in terms of looking at the transits to the natal chart, hard aspects from the malefics.
Hmm.
So, a conjunction, square, or opposition, especially from the most challenging malefic, those are the ones that you want to watch out for and be the most careful about, because they're the most dangerous and they're the most have the most potential to cause problems. when the most negative planet in the chart by transit is closely aspecting, especially within a degree, some of those prominent parts of the chart.
Right. And so everything we're talking about now also goes the same for emphasizing proactively the most positive planet in the chart and its transits. It's just that usually when you come down to, because I'm noticing that we're kind of talking about the negative a bit more, but that's, I think, at least in part because usually when it comes down to the last two or three choices in terms of the standalone electional charts, often the process of elimination is kind of keeping away the worst transits. I find anyway.
Yeah, definitely. You want to avoid the worst case stuff or mitigate it as much as possible. And the positive stuff, I mean, you do want to gravitate towards pretty much any close, exact aspect from benefics is positive, even if it's a square or opposition.
Hmm.
But even more so, it's even more positive. It's if it's a conjunction, sextile, or trine.
Hmm. Yeah, and you do see those too, of course. It's not, that I don't look at those. It just often it does become more of a process of elimination, but those would become, positive check marks in favor of a chart if it did have those.
Right. So that's good. So we're talking about transits. We've covered transits and how the electional chart is a transit to the natal chart and what transits we would focus on and which ones are deal breakers versus which ones are more negotiable.
Hmm.
Um, we've talked about what's prominent in the natal chart. I think we covered that pretty well.
Hmm. We did just go over the luminaries again, and just wanted to mention, of course, that we mentioned in passing the ascendant ruler, but that's also a really important one to apply those rules to as well.
Yeah, so the planet that rules the zodiacal sign on the ascendant or the ruler of the ascendant, which I guess by this point in the course you already know what that is. It's just a planet that rules the ascendant, whatever planet that is, and just paying attention to close transits to that planet since the ruler of the ascendant has an overall sort of jurisdiction of the chart in general, and therefore it's going to be really high up there in terms of those planets that you don't want afflicted or that you do want positive transits to, because then it's going to positively affect the entire chart.
Exactly.
All right. I think that's good. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we forgot to mention in transits. One thing that's funny that we didn't mention because we don't focus on it that much in the electional episode, but we didn't say anything about the void of course moon.
Oh, yeah,
And
because there was a question about that
yeah,
later.
somebody later
Yeah,
asked, they were
on
like,
Twitter.
what
Yeah,
about the void of course moon?
right.
Because it's like there's those three different definitions, which I already talked about in the electional course. And it's just ultimately not that important. I mean, what I mean by that is it got really overhyped in modern astrology because I think it turned out later there was like one astrologer, Al Morrison, who started making a calendar for void of course moons, and he really like hyped it, like promoted it as this major thing, partially in order to sell the calendars, and then it like took off and everybody adopted it. But then it became like a cliche thing because it's so simple to put on a calendar or to remember when it happens. It became like overhyped as this like major end all and be all thing of electional astrology.
Yeah, and I find in practice anyway, kind of like my first response was that usually in practice, when you're trying to elect something, one of the proactive points in what you're doing is having a positive moon application to something good in the chart.
Right.
And so it doesn't happen all that often that the moon would not apply to something good before it leaves the sign if it's an election you actually elected. Although once in a while, I have used an election where it still has to cross the sign boundary before it applies to something good.
Yeah, I mean, I find that if it's still applying within 13 degrees to something, even if it has to cross a sign boundary, then it's usually fine.
Yeah.
And if that's the next application, if it's within 13 degrees, which is the average distance the moon will cross in a 24-hour period, then it's fine. And most of the time in most of your elections, it's relatively infrequent that the moon's not applying to anything in at least 13
Yeah,
degrees.
definitely.
And even more infrequent, it's very, very infrequent for it to not apply to anything within 30 degrees, which is the original Hellenistic definition, although it does occasionally happen.
Mhm. And I mean, sometimes you do need to wait that long, the moon does need to wait a while to apply to the next planet that you're trying to get it to apply to. But really, in practice, when I'm actually deliberately electing something, it's closer in aspect than that. Like, it does, I don't know, it just doesn't come up that often for me if I'm deliberately electing things.
Yeah, and I have occasionally seen instances where there was something like the traditional Lilly definition where it was like not applying to anything within 13 degrees. And I don't remember, it was either across the sign boundary or with a sign boundary. And I think both of those may have some relevant interpretive symbolic meaning.
Mhm.
And there was some instances or a couple of instances I remember where like nothing really came of it, or like the thing just didn't end up going anywhere. It sort of fizzled out, not in a spectacular way, but it just ended up not being a big deal.
Mhm.
And where I felt like that interpretation was a little bit relevant in those instances, but most of the time it's not like this huge deal breaker that you absolutely have to avoid in all cases.
Mhm.
Especially the most common interpretation of the moon just being at the end of a sign.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes if the moon is at an end of a sign and it needs to change signs in order to complete an aspect, then sometimes that does indicate that there's like a change of circumstances before things come to completion.
Right.
But that's not usually like a huge issue. That's just like something that happens in the process once you launch the election. And it's like a footnote. It's not necessarily like a big deal to talk about or avoid or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is usually like then the moon will not be in a whole sign aspect maybe, depending on what the other planet where the other planet is placed.
Right.
And so that would be really one of my only considerations for like why I would prefer them to be in the same sign.
Yeah, and I think that's something to take into account because then they're in aversion by sign, but at least if it's applying within 13 degrees, then it can still be, if it's a conjunction, it can still be within the range of an adherence.
Mhm.
And if it's applying to a benefic, then that's a condition of bonification from the Hellenistic rules. And I mean, worst case scenario, if it's a malefic, it's applying within 13 degrees to a conjunction, then that's a condition of maltreatment, which is not good anyways. And then at that point, it doesn't even matter if it's void of course, according to some other definition. But
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, good to throw that in there because it's sometimes easy to forget if you're not really focusing on that, which we don't, like how much people think about that.
Yeah, well, it just comes back to this question of like prioritization and like what's most important. And that's one of the things also that even just astrologers or electional practitioners perhaps argue the most, because different electional practitioners sometimes end up emphasizing different things.
Mhm.
But that's one of the ones that I feel like people wrongly end up emphasizing way too much.
Definitely. Yeah, I get a lot of questions about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm glad we mentioned that here.
Mhm.
So, coming back to things, we've talked pretty extensively about transits at this point. I feel pretty good about that in terms of outlining the main things that people need to pay attention to. The other two areas that are relevant and potentially somewhat unique to us that I do sometimes integrate into elections is perfections and zodiac releasing, since those, together with transits, are two pretty important timing techniques that are pretty well integrated into my natal practice. And in electional, I do oftentimes, I mean, for my own chart, I do take into account, annual perfections and zodiac releasing. For client charts, I sometimes do to a certain extent, depending on the election, depending on the amount of time that I have to do it, and depending on just the overall context. Like how many natal charts are available? Is it even feasible to go through all of this? How long is the time frame? So is it really going to change or matter? So on the astrology podcast, we're going to do an episode this month on zodiac releasing. That'll be like an introduction to the subject. So that's something that will be out soon that people can listen to. I also deal with it very extensively in like an 18 or 19-hour lecture in my course. And then there's a 10-hour lecture on perfections, as well as a free episode I did a year ago on annual perfections and finding the ruler of the year. So let's start maybe with annual perfections, just as another filtering factor for determining which transits are more important in a given electional year.
Sure. So, actually, why don't you introduce this? Because I actually have used ZR as a narrowing down factor in electional work more than perfections.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's actually a better starting point because that's the exception to the rule about starting with the natal chart that I have done in the past, which is there have been instances where somebody's given me a long enough electional time frame, either for something career related or something relationship related, that in order to narrow down that time frame, I have looked at the natal chart and applied zodiac releasing to figure out what zodiac releasing periods they're in and which ones would be better or more active or more positive for that topic versus which ones would be more challenging. And I used that as a narrowing factor starting with the natal chart.
Mm-hmm.
Because what zodiac releasing does, for those that are not familiar with it, is it takes the entire life and it divides the life into chapters, which are sometimes very long. Like the general periods can be anywhere from a decade long to sometimes as long as 2 or 3 decades that are just activating one particular part of the chart and one set of configurations in the chart. So when you have something that's that long, that's a pretty significant narrowing factor that can help you determine, where a person's at and when they're going to be in one chapter of the life versus when they're going to be in another. There's also sub periods where you can break it up into individual years and months and days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I have occasionally used this as both, like you said, if there's a long enough time span that you're choosing from, as a way to kind of break that down more narrowly, as well as like a tiebreaker factor between kind of chart contenders. Because you can kind of see, I mean, in the first instance, like you were mentioning, you can see if a certain time period it will be significantly more positive, experienced as significantly more positive versus another time period, which can really make a difference in terms of how that person experiences, say, like the first year of their business or the first year of their marriage or something like that. So I have narrowed it down that way. And then between specific charts as a tiebreaker, I've sometimes just looked at, even though it's sometimes the smaller sub periods, you can still use those same techniques to see which ones will be better or worse. And it's kind of like looking at the transits as well, but it's another way to look at how this person will experience that period of time.
Yeah, definitely. And zodiac releasing is really amazing at certain types of things. I mean, the things that it can do, it does really well, but it's kind of restricted to 3 primary topics, which are you start from the lot of spirit or do zodiac releasing from spirit for career matters and matters of overall life direction. You start from the lot of fortune for health and bodily matters primarily, and you start from the lot of arrows for relationships and like love in general. And those 3 topics, if your election falls to one of those 3 areas, then zodiac releasing can be a really useful tool to look at and pay attention to that you, in some instances, might actually want to start with. Because, for example, in the spirit periods, it can tell you when a person will hit what I call a peak period, which is a period of heightened importance and activity within the context of their career. And if what they're launching is also a career related electional chart for launching something, then knowing when the person's going to be in a quote unquote peak period in zodiac releasing can be very useful information, because those are periods where they're more likely to hit high points in their career or do important things.
Mm-hmm.
So combining zodiac releasing in that way with the electional chart is good. It can help you narrow down timeframes, and it can also help you to identify timeframes that are going to be more effective for certain types of things.
For sure. And in addition to the peak periods, I definitely look at when the benefics or malefics are activated, particularly if they're in completely different periods. They are for some people and not for others, and we'll talk about that more in the other podcast. But that can be particularly helpful if you're choosing between 2 elections or 3 elections, say, that fall in different periods that really highlight either like the benefics or the malefics. With respect to the lot of spirit, if you're doing like a business launch, with respect to the lot of eros, if you're doing a wedding or something like that. And then if you're doing surgery or some sort of medical thing or health related thing, you would do the lot of fortune.
Yeah. And here we're again using sect to differentiate and identify the most positive planet and the most negative planet. And that carries through in zodiac releasing, so that the periods that are angular relative to the most positive planet are going to be the ones they experience as the most subjectively positive, and you're going to want to gravitate towards those periods. And the ones that are angular, so in a conjunction, square, or opposition to the most negative planet, are going to be the most subjectively difficult or negative periods. And you're going to want to avoid those periods if you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it starts being a number of different factors to have to weigh together, but I definitely do use that sometimes to tie break or to narrow down.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously we can't teach that entire technique within the context of this, but I just wanted to mention it in passing briefly because that is one technique that we would put up there if we were trying to really pay attention to the natal chart, and especially if we had one natal chart to work with. So if you have two and it's for something like a marriage, you can try to see when both of them have like overlapping peak periods or overlapping good and bad periods. And sometimes that does happen in relationships, but it can also be kind of hard to line those up very well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't always line up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's zodiac releasing. And that is really useful sometimes to give a starting point for broad overall timing periods. For individual years, for zodiac releasing, actually going back to that, I haven't found it to be that useful using it together with transits, but I have found annual perfections is very useful for determining which transits are going to be more important in a given year.
Hmm.
So that's important because you can use annual perfections where there's another podcast episode on this. I forget what episode it is on the astrology podcast, but just search for annual perfections and you'll find it. You calculate it by starting from the rising sign, and then you count one sign per year from the rising sign in zodiacal order, from birthday to birthday or from solar return to solar return. And whatever sign you come to, the ruler of that sign becomes activated for that year of the person's life, both in its natal position as well as in its transits. So once you understand that premise, you realize that there's some transits that are going to be more important in a given year. And in some instances, if you're really trying to zoom in on specific things and figure out different charts, you could use annual perfections to figure out which transits are going to be more important for that person that year.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I definitely use annual perfections in general. I don't think I've gotten to that point of using that for elections, but yeah, it definitely does narrow down which transits are the most important.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's just some years when for example, if you have a 2-month time frame and in the middle of it, the native's birthday happens
Hmm.
and they switch from like a sixth house perfection year to a seventh house perfection year and they're trying to elect a marriage,
Hmm.
that you might gravitate more towards the seventh house perfection year in terms of activating that part of their chart, especially if that part of their chart is well situated in a positive way.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense.
Yeah, so things like that. Other things just as a filtering factor to know what transits are going to be more important for them in a given year. So knowing that like either that Jupiter transit is actually going to be much more positive, and the fact that it's transiting over the ascendant is even more significant because Jupiter is the ruler of the year,
Hmm.
versus knowing that like Mercury is activated for them this year, and so if Mercury is going retrograde that month, that they actually might be more sensitive to that retrograde
Hmm.
than they would otherwise if Mercury is not activated as a Time Lord that year.
Hmm. Right, for sure. I mean, and it seems like that could also accentuate further the paying attention to the benefic of the sect and the malefic contrary to the sect in terms of, we already have some deal breakers or close to deal breakers in the mix there for those transits.
Mhm.
But especially if it's activated, then that's going to be all the more important. And you can see, oh, this is either like the best time to do this, or this is definitely not a contender.
Yeah, or things are like really lining up so that Mars transit going over this person's ascendant or descendant is like super highlighted and activated for some reason in this time frame,
Right.
and might want to move it outside of that time frame so that it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and that's perfections basically, is just applying that within the context of electional to further help prioritize, what's more important versus what's less important.
Hmm.
And that's just part of the general process that we keep repeating here of using the natal chart more at this stage as the final tiebreaker by going through these different things and prioritizing different things that are more important or less important in order to come to a final decision about this one seems to be the best option in terms of all of these options that emphasizes the positive things the most in the most instances and de-emphasizes the negative things in the most instances, even if it's not ideal, even if we wish there could be certain things that were different, that when it all comes down to it, the final tabulation is that this chart seems to be the best one that you can come up with.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it occurs to me as we're talking about this, a couple of things. One is that it sounds like I'm sure a lot of things to consider. I know that when people start with electional astrology, it sounds like a million things to consider, and so just kind of some reassurance that even though this is like a few steps beyond the actual standalone electional chart, you do get a hang of it if you start watching this a lot or you start practicing with it a lot. It does become clearer, I think, how this prioritization goes. And then the second thing is, sometimes it's really clear after this entire process that one is the definite winner. And then sometimes there's still a little bit of wiggle room.
Mm.
And you just kind of have to follow these prioritization rules and then just accept, again, what we started with when we started talking about electional astrology in the podcast, which is there are no perfect charts.
Right. There's
So,
no, yeah.
yeah. So, do not completely stress yourself out if you're like, I still couldn't find a perfect chart after doing all of these things.
Yeah. Well, and in some instances, it's like you can give the client your recommendation, but also you can sometimes just let them choose.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, here, let's say your two options. I feel like this chart emphasizes these themes more, and these are the positive sides, and these are the drawbacks. This chart, I feel, emphasizes these things more, and these are the positive things, and these are the drawbacks. What would you prefer to go with, me having said that?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes sort of take it out of your hands a little bit and instead turn it around and give it to the client and see what they think and what they would like to live with.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. And also that kind of reminds me of something else, which is for the most part, with many of these things that people want elections for, it's kind of clear like what's the most important things to consider,
Mm,
not just the general pieces of, say, like the transits, the angles of the natal chart, or general significators of the topic or what have you, but if someone's getting married, they want good partnership, they want a good home life usually. But sometimes it's good to ask up front before you go through this whole process about like what they're ideally aiming for the most, or what are the most important aspects of the venture for them, because usually that's kind of obvious, but sometimes it's not. And I'm thinking of, for instance, say like weddings. Some people have said to me, and we want to have children, and that's really important.
right.
Versus some people have said we're already have grown children, we don't care about that aspect, that kind of thing. So that's actually another important piece in terms of these kind of finalist charts.
Yeah, and not just the final, but starting even out the consultation and figuring out what their priorities are
Yeah.
to make sure there's not anything you're taking for granted or that they're taking for granted that isn't at all clear to you, because that could be a crucial factor
Mm-hmm.
where even going back to the very start of this, that you might want to pay more attention to like their fifth house if children is important,
Right.
and what the natal promise of the fifth house is, and then what the transits are to the fifth house or to the ruler of the fifth house,
Mm-hmm.
or if they have like time lords like perfections activating the fifth house that year or what have
Mm-hmm.
you.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'm trying to think of other instances of that. I mean, usually, for instance, for career, that both the public reputation and their income is important. But every now and then, I think I had one where like the income wasn't as important and it was much more about the public reputation, but they already kind of had money.
Right.
So, I mean, it is good to ask up front, like, what are the most crucial pieces of this for you that you want to go well?
Yeah.
Like, what do you want to get out of this?
Yeah, definitely. Like if friendship is important or finances are important or
Right.
yeah, their home life, like you said, or what have you.
Right. And some are kind of like obvious for most elections of that sort, but there may be factors that are not obvious that are unique to that situation that you won't know unless you ask.
Right, definitely. All right. So we've talked about perfections, we talked about zodiac releasing. I don't really use like secondary progressions or anything for the purpose of elections. Do you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you?
Mm-mm.
Okay. And I can't really think, because those became, I used to use secondary progressions and solar arcs when I did modern astrology, but once I learned zodiac releasing and inner perfections, I found those two timing techniques together with transits, so I guess three techniques, to be so effective and useful and to provide so much information within the context of doing timing for natal astrology that I just lost time to use some of those other techniques and sort of like lost interest, because they could sort of generally indicate things sometimes, and I could see that they're not, invalid or not useful at all. But the information I could get from zodiac releasing and perfections and transits was so much more useful and more specific in terms of what I was looking for, that I just ended up spending all my time focusing on refining those techniques.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that process. That I basically went through the same thing. I mean, and the only thing I can think of right now where I might take it a little bit into account would be Really, the only thing that I normally take it into account these days is if someone's approaching like the balsamic versus new moon progress moon phase. Just because I find that when people are like in that like end balsamic phase, like they're kind of like at a loss as to what's happening in their lives versus once they've passed the exact progress new moon, they kind of become more open to new starts. And that's really kind of like a basic and single thing about it. But that's like one piece I might, if it happened to pertain to that person's chart, I think it'll be pretty rare that that instance happens. But yeah.
Yeah, and it almost becomes like the same as like applying that in terms of if it's a new moon and it's like applying to a new moon or separating from a new moon in an electional chart and how you might want to gravitate towards,
Hmm.
separating from the new moon rather than applying so that
Yeah,
it's in the waxing phase of the cycle rather than the waning ending phase.
exactly.
Yeah, so progressed lunations, like a new moon or even a full moon, are important markers in a person's life. That is something you could take into account, and there could be like a better time to use that or a worse time.
Hmm. But those move so slowly, that I think in practice, that's why it doesn't come up very often.
Yeah, and that ultimately, especially with outer planet transits, is the biggest thing and the biggest obstacle about trying to integrate natal astrology when doing elections is that slow outer planet transits or slow long-term timing things like secondary progressions sometimes are in effect for such a long period of time that there's not much you can do with that. It's just background stuff that's going on that you have no control over and that the client's going to be experiencing for several years one way or another, whether you're involved at all. And so on some level, it almost doesn't matter if you're paying attention to or integrating that because you can't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess with outer planet transits, I do try to keep them from being super exact if there is a
Right.
choice and if other, more important factors are factored in first,
Hmm.
like the sex status of the benefics and malefics. But after that, I do actually kind of glance and make sure that the outer planets aren't like having super exact transits to especially crucial natal placements.
Sure. Or even like stationing, like a stationing
Hmm.
outer planet is going to be more amped up and more intense. And if that's also making a close, hard aspect to like a natal placement, then that's going to be actually more important than normal.
Hmm.
So paying attention to outer planet stations, especially in the electional chart, because then they become permanent transits to the natal,
Hmm.
as being something to factor in and pay attention to as well.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and just dealing with those as long term outer planet transits. But it basically comes back to what you just said, which is they're in effect for a long time. If you can try to get them so that they're not making exact hard aspects that are super close and see if you can put them off a few degrees at least, best case scenario.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think because in natal transiting astrology, an exact outer planet transit to a natal placement could either be experienced as positive or negative, but it just seems like too much power to bake that in to the election as a permanent transit.
A hard aspect.
Yeah, definitely. Like a hard aspect is what I mean. Yeah, so squares, oppositions, and conjunctions.
Yeah, I mean, because sometimes it's fine. It just depends on the election, and sometimes that's necessary. I mean, if the person is having, well, there's certain transits that just aren't going to be great. Like probably if, depending on what the goal is, if the person's
Mhm.
getting married and they have like transiting Uranus, like conjoining natal Venus or like the ruler of the seventh house, that may not bode well for like long term longevity of the relationship. And thus, there's something particularly unique or Uranian about the relationship that's going to keep it sort of manifesting that energy without becoming the victim of it and making it like burn out quickly.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, well, in that kind of example, it's like that could actually be setting off something that will otherwise become like a long-term relationship, even if it is still somehow Uranian.
Yeah.
But because of that, it's like, during that transit, even if the outer planet transits take a while, they're not forever. They're still like a few years, and then they move on. And
Well, and that's hard just because you can't control that though. Like if somebody's
no,
having a Uranus Venus transit and they come to you wanting a wedding election, that kind of still just comes back to the original point of you kind of just have to shut up and do it,
sure.
because you're trying to pick the best case, do the best you can to help them mitigate the damage, or accentuate the positive things.
No, I would agree, for sure. I mean, I guess where I was going with that is just simply that's the reason why I don't wanna bake it in super exactly if there are options to move it off by a degree or 2 degrees or 3 degrees, because
Right.
even though, it takes a while, like a few years to have that transit in real time, that's still short compared to having it forever.
Yeah, well, and here we could take like the applying versus separating rule thing
Uh-huh.
again, because that does kind of still apply to transits, not just elections, where, applying things are building up in the future and separating things are moving into the past. And so maybe you have Venus at a specific degree in your chart and you want to get married, and let's say a relationship just came into their life and it swept them off their feet, and the electional window is wide enough so that if you pick one election, that Uranus Venus transit is still building up, versus if you pick another election later in the year, Uranus is already departing from its final hit to Venus and it's already a few degrees away.
Mhm.
So that actually might be more acceptable, because then if you're presented with just like, let's say, those two options, because then it may be that the relationship had already come in and sort of swept them off their feet and really changed their life at that point. And while that is being built into the electional chart, it's not something that's still building up for them as a personal transit, but instead it's already moving into the past in some sense.
Definitely. Yeah, it's just symbolically showing what just happened before the event itself, before the wedding. I mean, the other thing that makes me think of is like if there's like a potentially like an outer planet hard aspect to something like Venus or whatever for a wedding, and it could go kind of either way in terms of positive or negative. If you do have it separating, then if something does go south, like during the process leading up to the wedding, as it like goes exact, they'll have that opportunity for it to be exact first before the election because
Right.
they change their mind or something.
Yeah, that's true. And that's probably something that should have been mentioned earlier. That's a rule for all transit analysis, is just especially with malefics, applying transits building up to something versus separating transits moving away from it when it's separating from the exact aspect, and how that's still relevant in elections. And this is actually one of the final and most tricky and probably most advanced part of electional that even I don't fully have a great grasp of yet, which is what happens after your election
Hmm.
as time begins moving forward in the immediate aftermath of the election. And one of the things is applying aspects are going to go exact sometime not very long, presumably after the election itself. So that's kind of a little bit important to take into account. We're kind of taking that into account by just paying attention to applying and separating aspects to some extent already. But I don't know, I'm not articulating this very well, but just the idea that there's some things that are going to happen in the sequence after the election is initiated,
Hmm.
that's a little bit tricky to take into account, that you can't, because it almost starts getting too complicated at that point to be able to fully do much with that.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, it's just too many factors at the point. It's like this is our cutoff. Like there's lots of factors already up till this point, but
Right.
that's way too many.
Yeah, in terms of paying a lot of attention to what the electional chart, how it grows and develops, or even like
Hmm.
progresses, let's say, or
Right.
what transits happen to the electional chart from that point forward,
Right.
and other things like that. It starts getting very tricky and very complicated very fast.
Right. I mean, but it is at least good to pay attention if there are any pretty close applying aspects that are still coming up like after the electional moment. That can be important.
Yeah. So not just so in the electional chart itself, of course, since we're
Mhm.
focused on applying aspects, but also just understanding that transits that come up immediately after the election for the native might be relevant in some sense as well, especially outer planet transits.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think those are all the points that I really wanted to cover tonight. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we should cover when it comes to the general topic of integrating the natal chart into the electional chart and using it as that final deciding factor to figure out which electional date to go with. I mean, I guess the last thing is just, integrating multiple charts,
Mhm.
even just like two charts into a single election. You're not always going to be able to get both charts to perfectly match up. And oftentimes there's some disparity where the electional chart, for whatever reason, just matches one chart slightly better, or it matches one chart better in one area and it matches the other chart better in another area. And there's like this trade off that happens. but
Yeah.
it's often hard to get both of them like perfectly matching the electional chart well.
It really is. Yeah, and I'm usually happy enough because of that. Because there's so many steps that have led up to this point already that you need to get, good or acceptable. That I'm usually happy enough if the standalone chart is pretty positive and if the synastry between the electional chart and the each of the natal charts is like pretty good or has like at least a couple good things about it and doesn't have, like, major bad things about it. Because 'cause you're not at this point, you've narrowed it down so much that you're just looking for more like, "Oh, that's really nice," or, "Oh, that's a deal breaker," you
Right.
know? And so you hopefully can get that in both charts at the same time, but you're not necessarily gonna get, like, 5 amazing things in each of the natal charts and or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and sometimes it's helpful at this point just to start tabulating and ranking them of like best and worst things for each person's natal chart for each electional chart and see if you can tabulate that, if you can like write it out and then just compare them to see, you know, which one comes out in excess. If there's like one electional chart where the good things are emphasized more and the bad things are emphasized less so that it just ultimately wins out in the final tally. And if there's one where the good things are not emphasized as much and the bad things are far in excess in terms of the number and the severity of them.
Mhm. Right. And so ultimately, you can still come down to a judgment call, or by going through this process, you can, in fact, find like a clear winner.
Yeah. So it's really going to depend. It's going to vary from case to case,
Hmm.
but these are some of the factors that you would take into account.
Just a few.
Just a few, one or two factors that you would take into account. So, like I said, this is basically, we wanted to give an overview of this, but this is essentially natal astrology, and this is like an entire course unto itself. This is basically what I teach in the Hellenistic astrology course. So, if this is something you're weak on, and that if you need to develop more very strongly, then this is something where you're going to need to study natal astrology more. Then I would recommend checking out the Hellenistic course because it's basically what I teach in it. Whereas here in the electional course, our primary focus is just how to pick good standalone elections on their own. And then secondarily, this little module about how to match that up and some of the things you would pay attention to in comparing them to a natal chart.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
People can find out more information about your work on your website, which is what?
LisaSchaim.com.
Okay. And you're always willing to help people with elections. You do electional consultations.
Hmm.
Um, and also are obviously my co-host on the Auspicious Elections podcast.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So people can find out more information about Lisa on her website, lisaschaim.com. And I guess that's it.
Yeah. I think we pretty much covered it. Yeah. So good luck with your electioning, and I hope that even if this sounds like an overwhelming number of steps, that this is a helpful guide. That once you keep doing it over and over, you'll really get the hang of it. And these are kind of like how to narrow down your best electional options.
Yeah, just through repetition and through practice. And I think I mean, you started many years ago now doing that. And that was basically just by doing it over and over again, you get a system down and it starts to become like secondhand or like natural.
Yeah, and that's why, like, I've mentioned that a couple times because I do think at the outset that it sounds like quite a lot of factors to juggle. But it's just through practice it starts becoming more second nature, and you start eyeballing things more quickly and that kind of thing. So it's not as actually as overwhelming as it might sound.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Brilliant. All right. Well, thanks for doing this with me
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. And thanks everyone for watching or listening. Good luck with your elections, with your natal stuff, and we will see you again next time.